This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. It's been 3 years since Russia first invaded Ukraine. Yesterday, the U.S. voted against a UN resolution condemning Russia for the war. And last week, President Donald Trump falsely accused Ukraine of starting the war, calling Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator. This is according to the New York Times. Essential infrastructure in Ukraine is under attack. Last July, Russian airstrikes targeted and destroyed Ukraine's largest children's hospital in Kyiv. This is just one of more than 1,000 healthcare facilities throughout the region that have been damaged or destroyed. That's according to the Human Rights Watch. Targeted attacks on medical facilities has led to a gap in care that the nonprofit Doctors United for Ukraine is working to address. Joining us now is Dr. Andrei Zinchuk. He's the Vice President and Director of Doctors United for Ukraine at Yale. Dr. Zinchuk, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions or stories you want to share, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Doctor, could you tell us about Doctors United for Ukraine? How did it start, and how has its mission changed or evolved over the last 3 years of war?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. And so Doctors United for Ukraine is a nonprofit, a 501c3 organization that really sprung up from the initial full-scale invasion in 2022. All of us who are part of this nonprofit are either Ukrainian-born or have some relationship to Ukraine or have deep sympathy, and we're all Yale faculty, staff, or members of the local community. And I think when the war started, we all realized that this is going to be a long haul. There's going to be healthcare needs that will last for years to come, maybe even decades. And in order to help buttress the Ukrainian healthcare system, we needed to do something that was unique. And one of the things that we early on decided to do was to focus on targeted medical supply aid that would go directly into the hands of physicians. And so I remember back in March of 2022, what we had done is we reached out to our colleagues throughout the country in Ukraine who are physicians themselves and were just as floored about the war and invasion and, of course, afraid, but also brave enough to stay and do their work and helped us understand what the needs were. And so one of the things that was needed was this fluid that was necessary to filter soldiers' blood as they were being brought in from the field into the military hospitals, and there was a huge shortage of that. And what we were able to do is generate a fairly quick fundraising campaign and purchase enough fluid to treat about 40 soldiers and send it to Ukraine through Poland in a matter of 2 weeks, which was a fairly rapid turnaround. And so given that, we received some feedback from our colleagues in Ukraine showing the survivors, people who were saved with this help. And it really was a catalyst for us to realize that we can actually make a big difference, even though we're a small organization. So it started as 3 people, and then we grew to about 20 at the moment. And
yeah, and this sounds amazing that you were able to do that, or you and your colleagues were able to do that in such a short period of time. And we'd love to learn more about the type of training, because I think contextually we hear a lot about needing aid, especially when war is happening, medical supplies, but you also need people who know how to do it. And I think as a non-medical person, you think, oh, well, they're physicians, they know what they're doing. But actually, during war, they're seeing very, very different kinds of patients.
Yeah, exactly right. And so the challenge that we've learned over the last couple of years has shifted from sort of hardware, physical supplies necessary, which are now being more regularly supplied by other NGOs, to skill-based needs, and also understanding how a health system works when you're transitioning and having rapid growth. So, believe it or not, Ukraine's healthcare system has undergone a tremendous growth in the last couple of years because of the needs. So if you think about in the United States during the COVID pandemic, some hospitals grew by 30, 40, 50% in their capacity to handle patients. And so a very similar approach had to be taken in Ukraine. And so one of the hospitals in Kharkiv, which is in the eastern part of the country, is a military hospital. There was an 800-bed hospital that ramped up their bed facility to 1,500 beds. And if you can imagine the change that is needed systemically to address the large volume of patients, not just the number, but also the types of disorders and trauma that they see is incredible. And so what we learned over the last couple of years is that there's actually a need to train physicians and help them figure out how to address this large change in scale and this large change in the disorders and the trauma that they treat.
What were some of the biggest differences, you would say?
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that has been a major challenge for the frontline healthcare, for example, is a lot of young men were being hurt in the war and they needed to be evacuated with limb injury, and so the tourniquets was a big hot ticket item in the early parts of the war. And so there were tens of thousands of units of tourniquets being sent to Ukraine's front line, and sometimes there was just insufficient training that was done for the medics on how to apply these tourniquets. How long do you leave them on? And that had led to development of a tourniquet syndrome, where the tourniquets were left on too long and led to amputation of limbs that did not need to be amputated if they were placed properly. And so one of the things that we have focused on is providing some training in terms of mannequins that can be used on the front lines to train medics to understand how to apply it, how long to use it, and where to put it. But that's just one example of things that are happening in the front line. And what we've done at Yale is actually have brought in some very young, talented, active physicians who are willing to learn and spread their knowledge when they go back to Ukraine. We brought them to Yale and done some training in high-risk obstetrics, so high-risk anesthesia care, trauma, facial reconstruction, and so on.
So how are they able to adapt to I imagine, the ever-changing healthcare going on in Ukraine?
So the adaptation has to keep occurring. Mm-hmm. I think at this point in time, probably the growth in skill development in Ukrainian anesthesiologists or critical care docs is off the charts. I mean, they have learned techniques and developed techniques that we don't know how to use in the United States, given the situation. And so they have been very facile at doing that. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges in Ukraine at this point in time also is a lack of personnel to actually do the work and do the teaching. As you can imagine, during the war, people reasonably are afraid, and some leave the country, immigrate, so you have sort of a brain drain happening in Ukraine in some degree. Mm-hmm. But the people who stay are extraordinarily motivated, active, and committed to the work.
When we speak a lot about physical injuries, because those are the obvious, what the eyes can see, but we've also had many conversations about the mental health aspect or beyond for the people that these physicians are treating. So what are some of the challenges in terms of providing mental health care to civilians as well during an ongoing war?
Yeah, and so I'm glad you brought that up, because this is one of those things that I think in the United States we're still feeling the aftermath of the mental health that we have to provide for the participants, from the Vietnam War all the way to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So I spent some part of my training and work has been at the Veteran Affairs healthcare system, and I've treated patients who were veterans of those wars. And the impact of war on mental health and trauma is immense, and it influences physical health. And so in Ukraine, there's essentially an epidemic of being able to treat not just the people who participated in the war, the soldiers, the people from the front line, but also the civilians who have undergo constant trauma. And so what we've done as part of our group is we have 2 psychiatrists on our team, and we have 2 psychologists on our team. And what they've done is they've actually pioneered some training sessions that we performed in Warsaw initially for Ukrainian psychologists who were sort of crossed the border into Poland to learn how to deal with acute trauma and the techniques on how to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is already developing in many individuals. And then in the last year, we've actually developed courses where our staff went to Ukraine, went to a couple of hospitals in Ukraine, and did 3 to 4 day teaching sessions for Ukrainian psychologists from across Ukraine, and teach them how to deal with military trauma, military culture, how to deal with acute trauma to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder if possible, and including sleep dysfunction, including substance use that people are using to self-medicate for that trauma.
Well, it sounds like this is a part of both short-term and long-term goals to be able to keep that sustainable, keep that care sustainable?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think in the short term, what we've done was we've raised funds and provided specific services to women and children who were displaced from the war, from the south and the east of the country, who were displaced all the way to the west. And so we essentially provided financial support for people to do this work, but we realized that there's actually a need on training and building capacity of professionals who can actually address trauma for individuals. And that's where we're focused on now. And in fact, one of our new initiatives for this coming year is to integrate pain management with mental health. And so we are looking to recruit and bring 4 physicians and psychiatrists from Ukraine who will get comprehensive training in chronic pain management that integrates mental health.
Well, and then talking about giving these professionals, medical professionals, the capacity to learn and treat those who are suffering from grief processing or their own stress and trauma. But what happens to the healthcare workers that we're talking about right now, right, where they're receiving the training to help other people? Are there people helping them?
So I think you bring up an outstanding point, and it is certainly a gap. And I'll give an example. I was in Ukraine just in November at a first national conference for women in healthcare, and there was this woman who was a cardiothoracic surgeon who works in the military hospital on the front lines. And she was describing the changes that she had to undertake to work in the front lines and work in the military. And I was talking to her about this specific question. I said, how do you deal with everything that you see every day and day in and day out, working 12 to 18 hours a day? And she says that, sometimes I feel devastated, but when I talk to the people I take care of, I don't have a right to feel this way. And so I think a lot of the trauma at this point in time is there. It's just being sort of buried under the weight of everything else that people are dealing with, and then feeling like they don't have the space to feel that way. And actually, one of our psychiatrists here works at the VA in West Haven, Shayla Amen. She was actually a paratrooper herself in her earlier career, and so she has been helping and providing some individual counseling to some of the physicians that we worked with that we've noticed that reached out to us as a way to help deal with the composite situation.
Well, and I'm glad to hear that there's both the short term and the long term, and I'm sure a lot of this will come out in the coming weeks, months, and years as we continue to follow this. And as we heard at the start of the show mentioning that over 1,000 healthcare facilities have been damaged or destroyed since the start of war. And I think the number is actually more than 1,700 as of this conversation today. I see you're nodding. Can you help us put that in context? How is that adding to the challenge of getting Ukrainians adequate healthcare?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's... where do I start? I mean, there are a lot of ways that this is influencing ability to provide healthcare. And, if you think about Ukraine's healthcare system, in 2021, in the last survey that was done, there was about 4,500 medium to large medical facilities, hospitals in Ukraine. And so if you put that in a context of 1,700 facilities being damaged, you're looking at more than 30% of the healthcare infrastructure, and that's just physical infrastructure. If you think about what has happened to the healthcare workforce, not simply of the people who were injured during the war or killed during the war, but people who had to stop practicing medicine or had to leave the country. So it's really a crisis. But from any crisis, there's always an opportunity for growth and redevelopment. And I think what's happened in Ukraine is that because of the need to reinvent itself, of the need to adapt, there's been a tremendous growth. And the people who are doing the actual development work are so motivated. They're working, up to 20-hour weeks, taking care of patients and taking care of their loved ones. And we have seen a tremendous change in how healthcare is practiced in Ukraine. So, for example, there have been new developments in kidney transplant programs across the country, new developments in liver transplant programs across the country. The way that breathing devices are used in Ukraine are now done more up towards the standards that are used in Europe and the United States. So there's been a tremendous growth and change for the positive as well.
Well, and as we learn more about what's happening there in Ukraine. There are things happening here at home as well. And we heard at the top of the hour that after President Trump's mischaracterization of the war and President Zelensky's leadership, are you concerned about American support and funding, which a large portion does go to Ukraine's healthcare, that might change?
Yeah, I think the short answer is absolutely. And I think the worry that I have is that the war in Ukraine has become a little bit politicized in the United States, where as a community, we generally like to think things of being black and white. And so war, it can be associated, well, the Democrats have supported the Ukrainians, and so Ukraine is a Democrat issue. It's not. I think the one message that I want to get across to the listeners here today, and also to those who may listen to it down the road, is that what Ukraine is doing is fighting for freedom. One of the tenets of American society is sort of give me liberty, give me death, right? And so that's what Ukrainians are paying for, that liberty. And it's simply people who want to have the right to self-determination, to have their own country, and to have the freedom to make choices of how they want to live. And this is, if that's not American, I'm not sure what is. And so I think one of the key messages that I have is that this is not a partisan issue. This is really an issue that has to do with survival of democracy and freedom of self-determination and choice. And Ukrainians are at the front line of that.
And is this a sentiment that you're hearing with your colleagues as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all, so I'm a Ukrainian myself, originally born and raised there, but now an American. I've been here for 30 plus years. But because we have the experience of having been to Ukraine, knowing what's happening on the ground, how people are feeling, and we understand that what they're doing is fighting for survival of their country and for the ability to choose who they want to affiliate themselves with, Europe or Russia.
You've been listening to Dr. Andrei Zinchuk, who's the Vice President and Director of Doctors United for Ukraine at Yale. You'll be staying with us. And coming up, we hear from a foreign correspondent on the ground in Ukraine, and we get an update from the Yale Humanitarian Lab. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. 3 years after Russia invaded Ukraine, nearly 13 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. That's according to AmeriCares, a global humanitarian aid organization based here in Stamford. Provesh Budden is Deputy Senior Vice President of Emergency Programs with AmeriCares, and here's what he shared with us yesterday.
We mark today 3 years of the war in Ukraine and entering a fourth year of war. And over this time, nearly 7 million people have fled Ukraine, and with more than 3 million people displaced within the country. And the impact of that on Ukraine's health system and people's own health has been immense. Over the past 3 years, the World Health Organization has reported that over 2,000 attacks have taken place on Ukraine's healthcare system. And that means that the attacks have destroyed infrastructure and led to power outages for health facilities and interrupting and delaying surgeries and endangering patients and health workers.
Joining us now is Nathaniel Raymond. He's the director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. Nathaniel, welcome back to our show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And joining us as well is Ian Lovett. He's a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and he joins us from Ukraine. Ian, thank you for being with us as well.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Andrei Zinchuk, Director for Doctors United for Ukraine at Yale, is also still with us. Ian, I want to jump to you first. You're in Ukraine right now. Tell us, what are you seeing?
There is 3 years into the war, there is a lot of fatigue here. The soldiers have been fighting without a break now for a long time. And as we heard in the intro to the segment, there are millions of civilians who are displaced. There are regular power outages all over the country. And so people are very eager for the hot phase of the war, as they often refer to it here, to be over. But that said, there's still a very defiant attitude in terms of what they're willing to give up. I think there's maybe a little more willingness to compromise now than 2 years ago in terms of potentially, at least in practice, surrendering territory, probably not recognizing any territory as Russian, but in practice, leaving Russia in control of some occupied parts of the country. But there's a lot of anxiety about the noise coming out of Washington in terms of what kind of security guarantees Ukraine would get if there were going to be a ceasefire now.
Well, and talking about those conversations you're hearing from Washington, and we mentioned earlier, too, that the New York Times had reported last week President Trump had mischaracterizations about what's going on with the war, falsely stating that Ukraine started it. And previously, the U.S. has expressed support for Ukraine and sent billions of dollars of dollars in aid. So can you respond to the shift that we saw last week?
Yeah, I mean, up until the last couple of weeks, the U.S. has been Ukraine's most important ally. Washington has sent around $70 billion in military aid since the start of the full-scale invasion 3 years ago, and at least another $30 billion in financial and other sorts of aid. That has been, particularly the military aid, has been absolutely essential in allowing Ukraine to fight off a much larger, better equipped neighbor. And so people are now here and in Europe starting to really think about what the prospect of trying to continue to fight the war without U.S. help might look like. The consensus at the moment from diplomats in Europe and from military analysts is that they should be relatively well equipped, at least as well equipped as they are now, for about 3 to 6 more months. But after that, they're going to lose some military capabilities that they've gotten from the U.S. that are very hard for the Europeans to replace. And in addition to that, there's also the question of the human cost for Ukraine and for Russia. The Ukrainians are increasingly thin in terms of manpower along the front line. And the Russians are suffering enormous losses, but it's also a much larger country. And so, I think Putin is perhaps gambling that they can continue to absorb those losses longer than Ukraine can.
And Nathaniel, what is your response to that, especially with the conversations that we've been hearing coming out of Washington last week?
Well, I think the next few weeks into the summer is really going to be one of the most important phases of the war. I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum with many of Ukraine's European allies in January, and including with Ukrainian government officials, and the mood was stoic, to say the least. There was a clear sense that Europe and Ukraine are figuring out how to move forward without the United States and without the military and financial aid that they have relied on. And so we are going to see, heading in through the spring into the summer, when fighting usually increases and the ground-based large-scale offensives occur, we're really going to see a recalibration in terms of what Europe is bringing to the table. As we speak right now, there's an emergency summit going on in Kyiv of European allies and others with the Ukrainians, and it really marks a stark shift from the past 2+ years of the war.
And so we're going to be digging deeper into everything Nathaniel just said. But before that, I want to play a clip here because earlier we also spoke with Alex Kuzma. He's the music director of the Ukrainian vocal ensemble based here in Connecticut. And he spoke about how the Ukrainian American community is responding to President Trump's current framing of the war and also what his community would like to see from the Trump administration.
We've been trying to spread the word about what's actually happening in Ukraine, and especially the horrific genocide that Vladimir Putin is trying to perpetrate against the Ukrainian people. The people of Ukraine have been amazingly heroic in their resistance to Russian aggression. And it's really important for the United States to maintain its strong support of Ukraine and not to force Ukraine to capitulate, not to throw it under the bus, so to speak. Today's comments or yesterday's comments from the president and from Defense Secretary Hegseth and others and Vice President Vance were deeply deeply upsetting to the Ukrainian community here in Connecticut because it seems like before they've even started the negotiations, they've basically given in all whatever leverage they had against Putin. It's like they're ready to give it up. I mean, Putin is very very afraid of Ukraine entering NATO because it's now the most effective fighting force in all of Europe. But we really are insisting that the president and the Secretary of State, Rubio, and others, before they make any decisions regarding Ukraine, that they at least visit the country.
So that was Alex Kuzma, who's the music director of the Ukrainian vocal ensemble that's based here in Connecticut. Dr. Zinchuk, would love to bring you back to the conversation. Can you respond to what we just heard from Alex?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I think that probably is true. I mean, most of the Ukrainian community members that I've interacted with are in the same state of being very much surprised and shocked. And so actually, I will also, give a little bit of anecdote. I speak with my Ukrainian physician colleagues constantly, and so I actually, on the way here, I spoke to an ICU doc who works in the field hospital a few miles from the front line, and he's in sort of a respite for a day or two. And, he was saying that the Ukrainians in Ukraine are actually just as shell-shocked as our Ukrainian community here. I think that there was a perception that with the new president and being more, quote-unquote, decisive, and there'd be more action going towards pressuring Russia to come to the negotiating table. No one really expected this change in U.S. policy and at least the rhetoric that is coming towards Ukraine. And so I think it's deeply concerning for Ukrainians, disheartening, and there was a lot of, I think there was some hope for faster resolution of the war, but certainly not in the direction that's being currently portrayed by the administration.
Well, and Ian, the language that President Trump is using is similar to the way that Russia is using to describe Ukraine, and this is based on reporting from NPR. Can you give us some context behind these narratives?
Sure. President Trump has been mentioning some of the same things that have been Russian talking points for a number of years. I think the most obvious of those is questioning Ukrainian President Zelensky's legitimacy because they haven't had an election now in more than 5 years. And under the Ukrainian constitution, they're not allowed to hold elections during martial law, which of course this is. And in fact, just today, the parliament passed another resolution reaffirming that stance and saying that they would hold an election when there was a sustainable peace. But I think that in particular has been very alarming for a lot of Ukrainians because that is something that Putin has been trying for years now to use to delegitimize Zelensky as a negotiating partner. And it seems that President Trump has picked up on that language.
And Nathaniel, you are also in constant contact with President Zelensky's office. How are they responding to what's currently unfolding?
I think the office of the president was in the initial phase after the election working really hard to outreach to President Trump and to the Republicans and to create a space for dialogue. Given the events of the past week, the tone in Washington changed, and so did the tone in Kyiv. And I think we really need to watch what happens in the rest of this week into the weekend with the summit in Kyiv with the Baltics and the European partners joining Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. That represents a very stark shift on the Ukrainian side, and really a 180 shift from their posture of trying to embrace Trump earlier in the year. Now it's a turn towards Europe, and that's a reaction to the messages from Washington, from the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, and the President himself. And so the next few days are really going to be decisive. And I think we are seeing Ukraine and Europe huddling right now, and they're going to announce what's next. And it may be very different than what we've seen in the past 3 years of the war.
Right. And it was also brought up that there are going to be peace talks. And so when it comes to peace talks, Nathaniel, is there any room for negotiations? What are you hearing from Zelensky's office?
Well, I can't speak for the president's office in any way, but I can tell you that the need for Ukraine's urgent need right now is really for the issue of children who are being held in Russia, prisoners of war who are being held in Russia, and civilian adult detainees, many of whom were taken from Mariupol 3 years ago through the filtration program, for those people to be identified, their locations to be known, and for there to be increased return of prisoners. And there's a real need on the Ukrainian side for accurate information, which particularly on the issue of the stolen children, the Russians have not provided. And so, putting all politics aside here, what's very dangerous about the current moment in terms of Washington's posture and what it means for Ukraine is that these concessions are being given by the Trump administration to Russia with absolutely no leverage or no consideration about the thousands of children from Ukraine who are in Russia's custody. And so what's very concerning for, I think, everyone who cares about Ukraine is that the Trump administration appears to be giving up the farm without any effort to get the kids and the prisoners back as a precondition for negotiations.
Okay, I want to come back to this topic in a brief moment, but I do want to hear from Yanti Shripto. We spoke to Yanti yesterday. She's the president and CEO of Save the Children, and she told us that children have been severely impacted by this war.
Save the Children's founder famously said 105 years ago, every war is waged against the child, and we completely see that play out in Ukraine today. We're still seeing, of course, the very immediate impacts, right? Over 3,500 schools being damaged, over 2,000 hospitals being hit and damaged, 2,500 kids losing their lives or being severely injured. And of course, thousands more losing parents or family and friends. But we're also starting to really see the longer term impacts of a war that's been going on for this amount of time. So, and I would say what is of particular concern to us are the children and the families caught up in the areas that are currently not under the control of the Ukrainian government. So the east, large parts of the east of the country, where it's been really difficult for organizations like ours and many others to actually reach those affected communities.
And Ian, can you respond to what we just heard from Yanti, which echoes what Nathaniel was building upon yesterday, building upon earlier as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, millions of Ukrainians, when the war began and Russia advanced very quickly, were then caught on the Russian side of the line of control. And of course, that includes many thousands of children. Earlier in the war, it was much easier for civilians to cross the line and get back into Ukrainian territory if they wanted to. But that, as the war has gone on, has become much more difficult. And so, I really don't want to speculate about the number of Ukrainian children who are now in Russian-controlled areas or who have been forcibly moved to Russia. We know that there are a very significant number of them. But I think because the Russian side has been very opaque about it, it's very hard to make any kind of count.
Right. And Nathaniel, you mentioned this earlier, but last year, the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale did uncover that Ukrainian children are being deported into Russia and adopted into Russian families. And it's called coerced adoption and fostering and could potentially be a war crime. Can you expound on what's happening here and what and the scope of what's been going on?
Well, President Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, were indicted by the International Criminal Court in 2023 for the war crime of forced deportation of Ukraine's children. And what we uncovered and released to the United Nations Security Council in open session in December is that the Russians have been forcibly and coercively adopting Ukrainian children as if they were Russian children, which could constitute a crime against humanity. And so we've identified at least 314 children from the eastern part of the country known as the Donbass that have been moved into Russia and then placed with Russian families, and their Ukrainian citizenship has been renounced and replaced with Russian citizenship. And it's really crucial to understand here that what we're talking about is the largest scale industrialized kidnapping of children since World War II.
And Dr. Zinchuk is with the Doctors United for Ukraine at Yale. You've been following along this conversation, especially with what we're currently talking about. Is this something that you're seeing on the ground, hearing from your colleagues? What are your thoughts?
Thank you. So it's hard to hear, and it is the reality. And I think historically this really harkens back to the era of the early Soviet Union and ethnic cleansing and genocidal activities that occurred during that time. And so, as a personal anecdote I'll share, my grandmother, when we were in Ukraine, had always been sort of afraid of the Russian side of the country, of the Soviet Union, and had been sort of very reluctant to adapt to the Russian culture and all the things that were requested to be done by the other Soviet republics during the Soviet Union era. And we, as the family who never experienced that, never realized it, was sort of complacent about it. It's like, oh, grandma, you're just worried. But we're reliving it now, and we're seeing the wrath and the determination with which Ukrainian society is being cleansed and war crimes are being committed. And so this is really hard to hear for all of us in Ukraine. And, in terms of serious impact on the children, it is not just I don't want to say just, but not only simply that the children have been abducted and we can count their numbers and we know what the impact on the family. It's also all the children who are in Ukraine now who are going to school in underground schools, who do not see daylight, many who have not been able to attend school for years. And so that's going to have a tremendous impact on the educational system and educational achievement for all these children. So the impacts are harrowing for decades to come.
You've been listening to Dr. Andrei Zinchuk, who's with Doctors United for Ukraine at Yale, and also Nathan Raymond, who's the director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health, and Ian Lovett, who's the foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. They'll all be staying with us after the break. If you have a question or a comment about the war in Ukraine, join the conversation 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There are nearly 7 million Ukrainian refugees recorded globally. That's according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And those that have remained in Ukraine have had to adjust to the stress of daily airstrikes, which is a new normal. We spoke to Larissa Bobby. She's a Connecticut native living in Ukraine, and here's what she shared with us.
The body gets used to things that are repeated continuously. One gets used to hearing air raid alarm sounds. You get used to hearing explosions. I've gotten very used to hearing explosions. When I spend time abroad, I'll say this in a perverse way. I miss them in the sense that like my body expects them to happen, and when they don't, it feels like something's missing. It's not that I want them to be there, but we're that kind of adapted in that sense. At the same time, I went to a film premiere the other night of Oleg Sentsov's Real. I have been to a piano concert in a museum presenting a very well-known Ukrainian composer, modernist composer named Lyatoshinsky. I have spent my days translating the poetry of Maxim Krivtsov, who is a Ukrainian poet and defender who was killed at age 33 last year, defending Ukraine from Russia's invasion. I even managed to go to a dance on Saturday night. So Ukrainians are persisting, and I'm very much participating in this at the very same time as we're being brutally attacked and under threat of being wiped out.
That was Larissa Bobby. She lives in Ukraine and is the author of the blog and book, A Kind of Refugee. So, Ian, I want to come to you here. Ian Lovett is the foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, currently covering Ukraine. Can you respond to what we just heard from Larissa? Does it reflect with what you're seeing today as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that description of life carrying on in these very different circumstances is absolutely right. I mean, the sound of air raids certainly in Kyiv are very normal. For the most part, people completely ignore them. They continue. The diners are still sitting in the cafes. People do not go to the basement. I think the sound of explosions, I'm not so sure. I certainly don't feel like I've gotten used to them. And I think a lot of people do react when they hear explosions much more so. But there is still a very vibrant life going on in Kyiv. There are like nightclubs that now hold their parties during the daytime because there's curfew. So they don't do that. I also went to a film premiere a couple of weeks ago, and they warned us beforehand that if the air raid alarm went off, they'd have to stop and they would resume once they'd finished. There's still all kinds of cultural activity happening here, and I actually sometimes I often encourage my friends in Berlin, where I live when I'm not in Ukraine, that they should come visit. And when they express anxiety about the danger, which is understandable, I'll tell them that on a lot of days in Kyiv, if you go to bed early, you might not quite notice that there's a war on, because life feels very normal in a lot of ways. And if you scratch the surface, obviously it isn't. But for the most part, like the normal things that people do during the course of life are all still happening.
Well, it's amazing to hear that there's a lot of normal still when there's so much anxiety and stress happening, and especially with the last 3 years. And you've also been covering the war since the start. And before doing this, you were also the religion and breaking news reporter in the U.S., which is your beats. Has the last 3 years impacted how you cover this war?
Sure. I mean, I had never covered a conflict before this. I think probably most of all, I understand Ukraine as a country much better than I did before I came here, and I understand what conflict does to civilians, to soldiers, in all sorts of ways, much better than I did at the start. So it's affected me personally in a huge way. Yeah.
And earlier we spoke about the potential of funding cuts, or just the uncertainty of just not knowing if the federal funds are going to continue. Nathaniel, looking ahead, what should humanitarian organizations prioritize to be able to best support civilians in Ukraine as the war continues?
Cuts to U.S. foreign aid and the freeze on USAID has impacted everyone who works in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's impacted us at the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. But most of all, it's impacted organizations on the ground who've seen, in some cases, a 50 to 60%, if not more, deficit come out of nowhere in the past 2 to 3 weeks. We're looking at international agencies, but most of all, Ukrainian domestic agencies, laying off staff at a critical time when the needs are still high, particularly in winter, particularly with vulnerable populations such as the elderly, particularly in occupied areas and areas close to the front. And so we're at a moment now where it was a crisis to begin with, but with the aid freeze and the cuts, it's a catastrophe. The main thing right now is that everyone's trying to figure out, really worst case scenario triage, because we're in the worst case scenario, which is we've lost so much money now when we didn't have enough money as a humanitarian community to begin with, that people are having to make awful choices about what is truly essential services. I know Andre can speak to this, to those in the health sector. They already were working on a shoestring, and now that shoestring got cut with scissors.
And you'll have a couple of minutes here, but I do want to get some final thoughts. And actually, Dr. Zinchek, with what Nathaniel just shared, what are some of the things that you're prioritizing, especially during times of uncertainty and not knowing if you will get those funds?
Yeah. So thank you. So, I mean, for us, fortunately, most of our funding comes from the community here in Connecticut and other philanthropists in the United States that have felt that this is an important priority for them to invest in. And so for our particular nonprofit, it's not as impacted by this. But these cuts and these holds on finances are extraordinarily harmful to the efforts in Ukraine currently. And for example, one of the hospitals that I was in the past November in the city of Lviv runs a rehabilitation center called Unbroken, and one of the foremost centers for rehabilitation in Ukraine for mental and physical health. And the two floors of their building have been built with the help of U.S. aid, and this is essential work. This is not sort of the fat that needs to be trimmed from the U.S. aid that people are referring to. And so the impact is really tough, and people are making very hard choices. And so I think this really gets at the bottom of, for people who are already down on the ground, struggling to survive, you're making them make choices that are even harder to make at this point. And so I think all we can do as a community is try to support each other. And so, and that's what's happening in Ukraine. So a lot of the medical aid actually occurs through small nonprofit organizations, 15 to 20 to 30 people at a time, who are carrying aid into the hands of physicians, into the hands of the medics, and providing the help that's needed. And so those are really grassroots organizations that are carrying the load right now.
And Ian, got about a minute here, but no, there's a lot of things going on right now and things are changing on a daily basis, but anything that you're prioritizing that you're looking out for the next couple of weeks, and any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think the big question here is, this is a landmark moment for Europe in a way that includes Ukraine. That I think there had been some consideration before the last couple of weeks of what Europe would do if the U.S. pulled back from being the main guarantor of security in this region, but it's very suddenly become it seems like it's very suddenly becoming a reality to a lot of people here. And so I think what happens in Ukraine is really going to be a harbinger for how Europe is going to be able to handle providing its own security without the kind of aid from the U.S. that it's gotten for the last 80 years.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. You've been listening to Ian Lovett, who's the forward correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much, Ian, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're also listening to Nathaniel Raymond, who's the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. Nathaniel, always appreciate your time.
Much appreciated.
And also with us was Dr. Andre Zinchuk, who's the vice president and director of Doctors United for Ukraine at Yale. Thank you so much, Doctor, for
Thanks
being
for having
with us.
me. Appreciate you covering this.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible and Kathy Wong. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.